Thank you for tuning in to the Helium Radio Network. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
We're live, the Mind Book Fair, powered by Life Improvement Radio here on the Neil Haley Show. And I'm with Eric Rimmel. Eric, how are you? How excited are you?
I'm great. We're actually almost coming to a close here. We're on our last few interviews for the day, and it's exciting to get to talk to so many new and interesting people and learn all about their stories, and I'm looking forward to our next interview.
All right, so I'm excited to welcome to the program author Carrie Gibson. She is the author of, and give me a second as I'm looking at El Norte, the epic and forgotten story of Hispanic North America. How are you, Carrie? Thanks for calling.
Hi. Thanks for having me on.
So my question is, how did you get involved in this type of research, involving this types of stuff? Tell us your background.
So I grew up in Georgia, but I've been living in Britain for the last 20 years. And the story of El Norte kind of has two parts. So the first part is that when I was in high school, I went to high school in Dalton, Georgia. And when I started high school, Dalton's just a small Appalachian town, and it had a mostly, English-speaking student body. And this is the 90s. And by the time I graduated, we had a big influx of Spanish speakers, so much so that the morning announcements were in English and Spanish. And this is over 4 years. So it was quite a formative experience. This is where I learned Spanish. This is where I went to school with children from mostly Mexico at that time. Dalton is the corporate capital of the world, or it was then. So there were a lot of jobs. So people were coming up for jobs and to work. And the town now is about 50% Hispanic. So that was kind of the background, that was the seed that was planted many, many, many years ago. And then in the intervening years, I moved to England, and I did a Ph.D. working on the Hispanic Caribbean islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic in the 19th century. And so my first book was about the Caribbean. And when I went to work on my second book, I realized that there was just a lot that I wanted to know and put together about the Hispanic past. And so I sort of thought about that moment, in high school and those changes. And I kind of worked backwards from that. I kind of, it's like I pulled that thread, and then it was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a really, really long story. So 500 pages later, that's how it kind of came about.
Very interesting, Eric. Question for Carrie.
It's just got to be almost like I would imagine a culture shock to grow up in Georgia and then move over and grow up in London. It's got to be, or at least in England, it's got to be quite a contrast, I would imagine.
It is and it isn't. I mean, in the sense that that experience actually set me up for how international London is. In some ways. I mean, obviously, people in London are from all over the world, but this is. One of the things I've seen is, how towns away from the border have become more Hispanic. And that's one of the things I write about in the book as well. It's like, we think about the Spanish-speaking populations in the U.S. and people tend to think, Texas or New Mexico. And it's like, well, it's now the Dalton, Georgias, too. It's now places in Ohio or places in, South Dakota. And so, having that kind of quite international experience early on, when I got to England, it was a bigger scale, but I was absolutely ready for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's it been like writing the book? I mean, it's got to be a really interesting subject matter. And I know there's a lot of, obviously, negative press with, our current president and things that are going on in the Americas now. But it's almost like I would say a cyclical, or almost like a duplicate of kind of your story, where there's a lot of Spanish culture still coming into the U.S. and still, coming through. Have you got any feedback on the book, how it kind of, I guess, mirrors what's going on today in society?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely in conversation with everything that's going on, because one of the things that I sort of observed and I write about in the book is how the United States' sort of national story often, is presented as beginning with the Pilgrims or the first Thanksgiving or all these kind of like touchstone sort of moments. But actually, the Spanish are the first Europeans to arrive here. They end up putting a settlement in Florida in the 1560s, so well before anything happens further up the coast in New England. And so, if we take that as the starting point, if we go, oh, wait a minute, so the Spanish were here as well, like they were in Mexico and other places. And, actually we have this kind of connected history rather than a separate history. And I think if we think about the connections to our neighbors, it makes it kind of reframes, the U.S.'s position in the hemisphere, and then also its relationship with its Spanish-speaking neighbors.
Absolutely.
Second, third generation in specific areas, it might be a very small population of Hispanics, but there is still a population in North America in certain places that you just wouldn't think of.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And like one of the things I did in my book was I traveled a lot. I traveled a ton. I went to some of the obvious places like Texas and Florida, but I also went to places like Nootka Sound, Canada, and you'll have to read the book to find out why. But you definitely saw pockets of places with settlers that I hadn't known about until I started the research, or certain types of Spaniards who came later. So like there were people from the Canary Islands that went to Texas in the 18th century, and and there's all kinds of stories, and they are spread out over the landscape for sure.
And the landscape is an interesting thing, and I think that from your research, especially when you're hearing what's happening in especially the United States when it's involving Hispanic people, what are your the feedback in the book's such a great thing, but to tell the stories, but are you hoping for people that are kind of deceived by the true story, told a lie or a story of people coming to America and what they are based on what our president has done, or different factions and groups coming to different places? How do we learn from your book those mistakes?
One of the takeaways that I want people to think about is that, having Hispanic people from, either from Spain in the 16th century or from, Honduras who arrived yesterday, that story of immigration and movement of people is not new. This is not a recent thing. We are connected kind of in this history. I've gotten really positive feedback about this, which is nice. I feel like the story of the United States is very complex, and this is like one really important layer of it, and it doesn't exclude any other layers. There's a Native American history of the U.S., there's an African American history of the U.S., and they all sit with each other. But in this particular one, I really hope it makes people kind of understand that movement across the border, movement from, Cuba, and the situation of Puerto Rico. I mean, that was one thing that really surprised me, that after Hurricane Maria, somebody did a poll that showed that only about half the people polled who were in mainland U.S. even understood Puerto Rico's relationship with the U.S., that it was a, Commonwealth colony. And so, I would like to, I hope this book kind of makes those situations clearer to people, because I think there is kind of a lot of muddled knowledge and, dare I say, even misinformation. So if we kind of try to take a historical perspective on this, we can actually see, longer trends. We've definitely had moments of anti-immigration. We've had moments of mass deportations. We've had moments of, mass immigration across the border. I'm thinking like of the Bracero program of workers that started around the time of the war, and things like that. So I'm trying to, and I set the book in, in a chronological sweep, so it gives people a sense of that path that that the country has gone. I guess the country has traveled with its Hispanic people.
Eric, any thoughts?
It's such a deep subject. It's really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Do you have any other work on the horizon? Like, has this spurned any more future work, or is this kind of just going to be an isolated story?
No, I would definitely like to continue down this route. I'm sort of thinking of doing a bit of a deeper dive into Mexico, and definitely at some point I'll be doing something on Cuba. And that's one thing about this particular book, is I really try to include Cubans and Puerto Ricans in this story, because sometimes it tends to only be about the border. People just talk about the border, and it's like, it's a much bigger, it is a much more geographically bigger story than that. So, yeah, I mean, looking forward, I think, my heart's always kind of in the Caribbean as well. So I think maybe a story, another book that kind of relates to all this and kind of focuses a bit more on Cuba and Mexico might be my way forward.
Awesome.
I'm interested in the Puerto Rico end.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go to a question regarding Puerto Rico. That's so misunderstood. What can the United States do to have Puerto Rico become a better area? Like, how can the United States help in this process so that Puerto Rico can continue to grow as an area?
I mean, one of the things, I don't think statehood is on the cards kind of either way. Certainly Washington isn't going to spend more money on another state. But one thing they could do is, because Puerto Rico's strange status means that it's not really treated like a state, it can't, for instance, it's got a massive debt problem, but it can't technically declare bankruptcy like a city can in the U.S. Or a state can. So, I mean, they could definitely make some legal changes that would help the island kind of get its books back in order. But instead, they set up an oversight body in Washington to kind of take control of those finances called Promesa. And so you could give back more of that autonomy, perhaps. I mean, there definitely needs to be some more investment. And, the reconstruction work after Hurricane Maria has, it's incomplete. There's still a lot of infrastructure problems on the island. One of the reasons Puerto Rico got into trouble is that it used to have a tax-exempt status for businesses on the island, and there were a lot of pharmaceutical jobs and a lot of firms, and that got phased out in the 90s, but it kind of fully took effect into the early 2000s, and that really hurt the economy as well. And so, Puerto Rico's really had this kind of push-pull situation, and it's been treated differently than it has been. It isn't a state, and it isn't treated like one, but, you could bring some of its regulations more into line like a state and give them some more autonomy and also some more investment. And that could really help ameliorate its situation. And additionally, I think, Puerto Rico needs to be much more actively incorporated into curriculums. I think I don't even remember if I was taught much about Puerto Rico in school. It was just kind of there. It's kind of, and Puerto Rico. And it's like, how did this get here? So I think, definitely there's a need for its history to kind of be more actively integrated into talking about the U.S.
Eric, anything else to think? Any other questions?
Yeah, I was just thinking, kind of sarcastically humorous. I'm in total agreement with you. It needs to be incorporated into, education. I don't recall ever learning in school the exact correlation to Puerto Rico and some of the outlying changes of it. But in recent news, our president, didn't even know that we were tied to Puerto Rico based on some of his comments after the hurricane. So I was just chuckling that, maybe we need to school our politicians too.
Yeah, exactly. No, for sure. I think
where's the best? Yeah, that's a great point. I can't believe he didn't know that.
Yeah, so even people in the top office have something to learn about the Hispanic history of the U.S. So
exactly. Best place we can find information on you and learn more about you. Where can we go?
I have a website. It's carriegibson.co.uk, and I'm on Twitter at Carrie E. Gibson. You can just Google me, and my name will pop up. So.
Well, fabulous. Thanks for calling. I appreciate you coming on the show, and take care.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye. You're listening to the Neil Haley Show, powered by Life Improvement Radio, live from the Miami Book Fair. We'll be back in just a moment.
Thank you for listening to Helium Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and should not be construed in any way as advice from Helium Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by producers, writers, and editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the express written consent of Helium Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.